Welcome into the College Basketball Power Hour. That's Jason Fitz. She's Ice Young. I am Caroline Fenton, your normal and your regular programming in squad headed back for this week. And I just would like a little bit of Cooper Flagg talk every single week, because how can you not talk about this guy? I mentioned how there had already been some clinches of the regular season titles. Duke, of course, has wrapped up that title as well. They have clinched their share of the ACC title after absolutely clobbering Wake Forest on Monday night. Ice, is that Cooper Flagg's final game in Cameron Indoor? I know there were some one more year chants happening at Cameron Indoor, but was that the last that we've seen from Cooper Flagg, at least at Duke?
Yeah, I think so. And honestly, rightfully so. With a player that just entered college basketball with immense expectations and pressure, he certainly has delivered. I mean, they're the number 2 team in the country. They're 17-0 at Cameron Indoor this season. Well, I think I would want to leave that way too. I mean, the one more chance are just, the endearing love of the Duke fans and the crazies that are just letting him know they'd love to have him come back. But he certainly made his impact felt. And at this point in the season, man, I'm just excited to see him in March Madness, honestly. I'm excited to see game in and game out where he knows he has to pull out wins for Duke. You talk about a player that leads them in points, rebounds, assists, blocks. Like, it's ridiculous at this point how important he is to Duke's success. You think a team in the tournament might just say, hey, if we just triple team him and make everybody else beat us, do we have a decent chance? I think you might, but certainly has been an awesome career for him at Duke. And he made it count. I think that's the most important thing about being a player. You got to make every game count. And he really did.
I mean, he's the first freshman in over 30 years to have over 400 points and over 20 blocks in conference play in a season. And you just think about what that means. And it's so hard to be historic at Duke, right? Because there's just so many great players. To me, I understand the one more year, and I love the one more year because as a college basketball fan, I want to see another year. But I also watch the chants happening thinking, man, sometimes you need to change your logic just a little bit, because while we're all going to sit here and lament what it would be like to see Cooper Flagg for another year in college basketball, I think you just got to slow everything down and appreciate every second you got with him while he's in the sport, right? Like, whatever Duke does in the tournament is just going to be an opportunity to see what looks like. I mean, go back to that last game. On one possession, he's got 2 guys in his face, and he throws up a 3 that looks absolutely beautiful and goes in. Then a couple of possessions later, he drives the lane with his non-dominant hand in between 2 people and manages to get that in. Like, it's just, he does everything. And that's going to look beautiful in the NBA. It looks beautiful right now in college basketball. I think this is it for him in my mind. If we're lucky enough that he changes his mind for some reason, well, great. But I think this is just about appreciating the moments that we're getting from Cooper Flagg, because I think they're about to come to an end.
And selfishly, we all want Cooper Flagg to come back to college basketball. How fun would that be? What kind of story would that be? But, from the professional side of things, he's going to the NBA. I would never, if I was in Cooper Flagg's corner and giving him any sort of advice, which obviously I am not, I'm telling him, go to the NBA, make your money. You'll be the first overall pick in the NBA draft, and allow all of the fame and the fortunes and the success come your way. But I know when I said that, hey, we're going to talk about Cooper Flagg, we're going to do it every single week, there are probably a fair share of listeners that roll their eyes, that might have a little bit of Cooper Flagg fatigue, the same way when we had Zion watch in the 2018 and 2019 seasons, that it was, every topic on SportsCenter, if it was every topic of every article that we saw on yahoosports.com, and there was probably a decent bit of fatigue, and we see that all the time in sports. We had Tom Brady fatigue. We had Chiefs fatigue. We might have Shohei Ohtani and Dodgers fatigue. It's natural with sports fans, but we do it for a reason. And I think that this is an opportunity for all of those people out there that might be rolling their eyes, talking about, Cooper Flagg and having Cooper Flagg fatigue. Just look at what this kid is doing. At 18 years old, as a freshman, he leads the team, Duke, the number 2 team in the country and one of the favorites to win it all, Leads the team in points, leads the team in rebounds, leads the team in assists, leads the team in steals, and leads the team in blocks. He is largely carrying one of the best teams in the country and one of the most competitive seasons that we have seen in this sport. So I understand the fatigue. I understand can we please talk about something else? But we need to take some time and just kind of, look at everything for what it's worth and truly just appreciate what he has been doing. Cooper Flagg has been nothing short of spectacular, Fitz.
But this is also, to go back to a conversation we had last week, one of the advantages the women's game has right now that the men's game just doesn't, because I'll be the old man on the block for a minute. We all know I'm from Vegas, but I grew up watching Larry Johnson and Stacey Augmon and Greg Anthony and a Running Rebels team in the, I was a little kid in the late 80s, early 90s. And I think one of the coolest parts of that is when the season ended, all you were thinking about was next year. Man, we got him next year. Because you knew back then that these guys were going to play together for a certain amount of time. It's just, that's one of the things that right now is we see some of the stars that are transcending in women's college basketball. You get to see them year in and year out. You get to grow with those storylines. It's just a bummer. There's no fix to it. There doesn't need to be a fix. I want Cooper Flagg to go make all of his money. I want him to be an NBA superstar. But as a college basketball fanatic, I feel bummed sometimes that this is the world we live in. We don't get to spend the next 6 months after this season talking about what's Cooper going to look like next year. And oh my God, how do you stop? I wish there was a system altruistically in my mind that let us have these guys in the sport more. Cause I think at the end of the day, those storylines, they become the things we gravitate to. I never want to stop a young man from earning his money. Go get yours. But man, I'm just bummed that we only get 1 year of this. And that's the cycle. When you have the best of the best in college basketball, they will walk away as quickly as possible.
And I think that's kind of the flaw in the system of the one and dones of, you get 1 year of stars. And we talked about this on the show last week, which of course you can find on YouTube and your preferred podcast platform. The reason why there has been so much popularity and so much investment in the women's game, obviously, first of all, it's talent and the fact that it is such a fun sport to watch, but it's also retention. That we've had Paige Beckers for the past 5 years, that we got Juju Watkins being able to take a step forward in year 2 at USC, that we got back-to-back years of excellence from Caitlin Clark when she was at Iowa, that you have so much consistency and so much retention in the women's game that it's easy to fall in love with some of these players year over year over year. But when you only get 1 year of a Cooper Flagg, when you only get 1 year of an insert the next, one and done superstar here, the turnover starts to become a little bit overwhelming, and I think that's where you're starting to see a little bit of a divide between the men's and the women's game. But we get one final regular season game with Cooper Flagg as they hit the road to Chapel Hill, finish out the regular season at North Carolina this weekend. Expect to see another 20-plus point game from Cooper Flagg because that's just, frankly, what they do. Now, Duke's tournament hopes, those are obviously very locked up. It is more likely than not, I would be willing to put a lot of money on it, that Duke will be a not the number one overall seed, but a number one seed in the tournament. But this coming week on the women's side, we've got several teams making their case in their respective conference tournaments. We've got several men's teams continuing to make their case as they finish out the regular season and head into conference tournament play next week. So let's dive into that. Bubble teams, make the case. We'll start with the men's side. Ice, who is your bubble team? Which team will you make your case for to make the NCAA tournament?
Yeah, I'm going with the Baylor Bears in the Big 12. Normally a team that around this time of year is playing their best basketball and has been consistent, but they've had to weather several storms this season. They're 9-9 in conference. Last week they had just one game. They beat Oklahoma State. Didn't necessarily look the greatest, but they did beat them by 10, so did what they were supposed to do in kind of a must-win game. And I think the reason why I'm picking this team is because their game this week, they have a road test at TCU, a team that they lost to by 3 earlier in conference play. And I feel like if they win that game, they will no longer be a bubble team. They'll be good to go and feel very comfortable going into Selection Sunday. I feel like if they lose that game and then they lose their last final game versus Houston, which, we probably know how that's going to go, then come Big 12 tournament, they would need to win a game in the tournament to feel comfortable. And so I think that they, unlike some other teams we're going to chat about, have a good opportunity to solidify themselves and get out of that bubble. but I'm going with Baylor.
Yeah, I like that pick a lot. The only thing I was thinking about the committee and streaks, right? So the fact that they lost 3 straight before that, and then 4 or 5. So you just piece some of that together. I think you're right. Part of the reason they got to play really well is because whatever happens in Houston, you don't want that to be part of the narrative, and you just don't want to serve the committee up. Well, you lost 6 of your last 7. It's just it's amazing how momentum is seen in that way. I'll go with a team that it's a brand that everybody knows. But I think sometimes we have a hard time separating sort of the past and the present with some of this. Gonzaga is a team that's on the bubble, and I pulled the numbers on it, and this is what's impressive. They have 8 wins over top 100 opponents on the BPI. Their top 50 is only okay. Their strength of record's only okay. But in net and KenPom and BPI, they're top 10. Now, I think Gonzaga is going to get into their conference tournament and run through it. I don't think this is going to be a factor. I think they're going to earn their way into the tournament. And I want to say this loudly, y'all. All these bubble teams have it in front of them. You want to get in the tournament, get in the damn thing, right? It's out there for you. But I think Gonzaga's a lot better right now than their record is. Again, I think that's going to show in the next week and a half, and they're going to solidify exactly where they stand in this. But the fact that there are some that even have them on the bubble just speaks to the fact that we need to look at that resume a little bit.
And I think there is a lot of value in quality losses. And when you look at Gonzaga's losses that they have suffered, I mean, I'll look at a 1-point loss against Kentucky earlier in the season when Kentucky was a top 5 team. And obviously, things change, and Kentucky has fallen off a little bit since then. But still, obviously, a tournament team, still a team that I view, at least as a Sweet 16 and Elite 8 contender. I look at that and say, you know what? That's not one that you can be overly, picky about. That's not one that you can be overly concerned about. A loss to UConn as a top 20 team at the time. A loss to UCLA as a top 25 team at the time. I think not all losses should be looked at equally. And looking at Gonzaga's schedule, they have a lot of quality losses, which kind of brings me to my team that I'm going to make a case for on the bubble, and that's Georgia. I mean, it's hard for me to pick apart a lot of the resumes of some of these SEC bubble teams because it's the same thing that we talked about, Fitz, on the college football power hour, comparing SMU and Alabama and who would be the final team into the college football playoff. Well, when you compare those schedules, they're not equal. And I just talked about Gonzaga's quality losses. You just talked about streaks. Well, Georgia just went on this past month a 4-game losing streak. But it was against top 25 Mississippi State and top 10 Texas A&M at Texas A&M, a really tough place to play, a top 25 Missouri team, and then on the road at probably the most intimidating environment, if not one of the most intimidating environments in the SEC at Auburn, the number 1 team in the country. But Georgia followed that up with a win against a top 3 Florida team at home. And then they went on the road at Texas, another bubble team, and beat Texas. I viewed that Georgia-Texas game as win, and you're probably in, or at least win in your case to be on the bubble and to be into the NCAA tournament is still alive. Georgia has an opportunity to go on the road at a not very good South Carolina team, pick up another win there. And if Georgia finishes out the regular season with a win at home against a Vanderbilt team that I think is comfortably in the tournament, I don't even think that Georgia needs to win a single game in the SEC tournament. You finish out with 4 consecutive wins, 2 of those against, one against Florida and then another against a Vanderbilt team that's a very good team and can make some splashes in the postseason. A Vanderbilt team that's beaten Tennessee and Kentucky and has racked up, obviously Missouri this past week, racked up a lot of quality wins in conference play. I think that's really all Georgia needs to do to make that case. I don't think that you can make a case for Texas or Oklahoma to get into the NCAA tournament and leave Georgia on the outside looking in, Ice.
Yeah, I really like that pick. I think, like you said, with the week that they just had beating Florida and Texas, and anytime you beat the Florida Gators, it's great this time of year, especially knowing that we're late in February. Everybody thinks or wants to be thinking that they're playing their best basketball right now. So you're beating a very good Florida team who has awesome wins on their resume, but then they beat Texas by double digits like they were supposed to beat them. I think that's so important also this time of year is you're not edging out games to teams that you're supposed to beat and beating them by 3, 4, 5 points. Like they beat them by 15. You took care of business how you were supposed to. That also helps the committee give you, the head-to-head in terms of getting out of the bubble because you're passing the eye test and winning the way you're supposed to. So I think that's important this time of year for sure. I think those back-to-back wins honestly got it for them.
Yeah. Also, guys, 12 of their last 16 games for Georgia have been against teams that were ranked in the top 25 when they played. Like, you want to talk about the committee looking at it and saying, how does this team translate to the tournament? So what is the tournament? It's night in, night out, the best of the best. Well, I know they lost a bunch of those games, and some of them were close, but 12 out of 16 straight games against top 25, that's just a gauntlet. That's something that the SEC this year, because of the way conference play is patterned out, like, all of these guys have just played so many games in a row against the best. It's just, I think the committee's going to give a lot of weight to that.
Yeah, honestly, too, just the 4-game losing streak, you kind of expect it to happen. Because if you get the wrong 4 teams in a row, there's just no way that you can get out of that gauntlet, like Jason said. So it's understandable.
Which makes what Auburn has done so much more impressive.
Ridiculous. It's ridiculous.
That part.
It is ridiculous.
One loss in conference play. And I know that they have 2 games to go. And I know they finish out the regular season against Alabama, which obviously is going to be zero slouch. But I remember at the beginning of the season, I was saying, well, the SEC regular season champion is probably going to have 5 or 6 losses, probably going to have, not a very favorable record compared to what we've seen in years past, just with how difficult this season would be to get through the SEC. But Auburn with 1 loss, at least at the time that we're recording this podcast on Tuesday morning, honestly, like it's silly. Like it's stupid and so impressive what they have been able to do so far this season. But let's transition to the women's side. Make our case for some of these bubble teams. Ice, we'll start with you. Who is your bubble team you'll be making a case for?
Yeah, so every year for the past 3 years, including this year, I've been covering the A-10 women's basketball tournament. And I have it this year, so I'm excited to cover it. And so I'm going with an A-10 team that I think really deserves the nod. It's the St. Joe's Hawks, right out of Philly. I mean, they are a very good team. They're 21-8 overall. They're 12-6 in the A-10. And this time of year, especially on the women's basketball side, like we said, just the veteran leadership and the chemistry that you're playing with has to be high. They are led by a big 3 trio that have been playing together for 3-4 years now. I mean, they click on all cylinders, and their shooting percentages as a team, ridiculous. 45 from the field. They shoot 35% from 3 as a team and over 75% from the free throw line. Like, I just think in March, they could bust someone's bracket with the way that they play so efficiently. And they're terrifically head coached by Sydney Griffith. I think St. Joe's could be a very good team on the women's side, a bubble team that should make it to the tournament if they don't win the A-10 tournament. Right now, Richmond is a lock for that, and they were the regular season champs. But we know madness happens in March.
Do they have any work left to do, Ice, in your mind? Like, just what has to happen for them to get in?
Yeah, honestly, I think it's going to depend on this conference tournament. I think they would need to. They already have a double bye, which is fantastic. They get a ton of rest. But I think they would need to get to the championship game and put up a really, really, really good fight. If obviously you win it and there's no problem. But I think getting to the championship game in the A-10 tournament would be needed. And to be quite honest, I think the rest of the league respects them enough to know that they are a team that should get in at large. They have just been, honestly, pretty sensational when it comes to their game in and game out play. 2 of their losses in conference come to Richmond, who's number 1. So, they haven't lost games that they shouldn't necessarily.
All right, I'll give you a team on my mind, and I'm going to go Ivy League, not because I'm smart, but just because I think they need some love. Let's give some love to Harvard.
Yes.
And in this process, too, like, you can give love to the top of the Ivy League across the board. I think it's a pretty historic year for them. The problem for Harvard is Princeton, because Princeton obviously has played their way into this thing, and Harvard lost both of their games to Princeton. The last one wasn't a great game. Like, the first one, close game, you can sort of excuse that. The last time they kind of got their butts kicked. So I think there's work for Harvard to do. But if you look across, again, we'll go back to the net rating. Their net rating is 37 right now. Like, that puts you in the tournament in my mind. And they played through the Ivy League. And I hate perception sometimes because, people roll their eyes to it. But the Ivy League this year, particularly at the top, Columbia, Princeton, Harvard, all really good teams. I think the Ivy League deserves more love. I think Harvard should be in no matter what happens to the course of this tournament. They're 21-4. The net proves it. I'm in on Harvard, and a little bit of love to the ladies on the Ivy League side.
I love that pick. Last year, we saw 2 Ivy League teams get into the tournament. Princeton won the the Ivy League championship, and then Columbia got in on an at-large and played in a first four game. I also think for Harvard, though, we talk about superstars in March. Like, they are one of the best scorers in the country in Harmony Turner. Like, guys, she has dropped 41 points, follow that up with 38 points, has had 27, 33, a bunch of 25-point games. She is a lethal bucket. I also just think for the women's game, it would be fantastic to see her on that stage.
Yeah, she leads the team, by the way, in points, boards, assists, and steals. So, like, I mean,
she's ridiculous.
You just want to talk about, like, kicking ass all the way across the board and smart enough to be at Harvard. I don't know. Like, it's just some people, it's just not fair sometimes.
God's favorite. I mean, some people just are the full package. This feels like a year for the Ivies. I think there's 3 legitimate cases that you can make. Harvard being one of them, Princeton, like you mentioned, Fitz, and I think you can make an argument for Columbia as well. The issue is, are we going to see a world where there are 3 Ivies getting a bid into the tournament? Like, that's what concerns me about some of the Ivies or maybe some of these mid-major teams is they could get edged out, any at-large bids, because how many times have we seen an Ivy League team get an at-large bid, with the exception of last year? I don't think we've ever had 3 Ivy League teams get into the NCAA tournament. So will some of these mid-majors, the Ivies, some of these teams that don't play the gauntlet of schedules like an ACC, like a Big Ten, like an SEC, will we see some of these at-large bids? Will we see some of these non-conference tournament champions get those at-large bids where maybe there's a world where all 3 of those Ivy League teams get in? Honestly, I don't know if I see it, but I think Harvard probably has the best case of all of them, having the highest net rating. So I love that, Fitz. I'll go maybe not quite as smart, but still a team that we love very much. Still a very smart team as well. I was actually going back and forth between 2 teams. And I was trying to be very, objective with it. I was deciding between Seton Hall and Virginia Tech, but ultimately, I'm going to make my case for Virginia Tech. Seton Hall very much so has a case with my theme of the day, at least, quality losses. They're 21-8 on the season. 2 of those losses came against UConn. They lost to USC. They lost to LSU. 4 of those losses came against top 10 teams in the country and legitimate national title contenders. Lost to Creighton, who was unranked at the time, but now a top 25 team in the country. But Seton Hall doesn't have the wins that Virginia Tech has. Seton Hall doesn't have the strength of schedule that Virginia Tech has. So that's ultimately why I give the nod to Virginia Tech. And also because Virginia Tech has played 8 quad 1 games. Now, they've lost 7 of them. But I do think that there is something to be said about playing these really difficult games and going through the gauntlet of an ACC schedule. It's the win over Georgia Tech earlier in the season, and then wins over Louisville and Cal recently over the last couple of weeks. It's really that win over Georgia Tech earlier in the season that I think should ultimately push Virginia Tech over and get them out of the bubble. They're currently, I think, projected by Charlie Cream, the ESPN bracketologist on the women's side, as the first team out. But if Virginia Tech can beat Georgia Tech in their first game in the ACC tournament coming up on Thursday, I think that should be what should push Virginia Tech in. So obviously a win, if not more, in the conference tournament would be, the icing on top for them. But a win against Georgia Tech in the tourney should be enough for the Hokies, I think.
Those 2 overtime losses, though, are going to those are going to hang big over their heads. Like, they got 2 close losses in the last couple of weeks, right when it was their case to be made, and both in overtime. Like, that's just that feels like ice. That's the moment that you're sitting back in June saying, "Man, those 2 the 2 or 3 possessions kept me out of the tournament." You got to that would be hard to stomach.
I agree. I also, though, think that you make a really good case for Seton Hall. That's another team that I follow pretty closely, and I feel like they finished 3rd in the Big East, which is very high for them. They exceeded expectations. They have a bunch of veteran leaders. They're a team that plays really good defense. So if you give them a chance in the tournament, they might upset someone because they win the game 49-48. And Tony Bozzella is a coach that is experienced, that really does know how to win this time of year. So I think for them, they could have more of a chance and stack their resume if they really do some damage in the Big East tournament. But I like both of those picks. And Virginia Tech, very well coached by Megan Duffy. She formerly was at Marquette. I mean, she knows how to win this time of year. I don't think you can go wrong with either one. Again, because of strength of schedule and just being in the ACC, it helps you so much because you know that you still are getting battle tested a lot.
The only thing I'll say for Seton Hall is that they don't have to win a lot in the conference tournament. They can't have another Connecticut game. Like the two losses to UConn have been ugly. And I don't think you can put that on tape and then be like, no, we belong in the tournament. Like, we just got beat by 50 by UConn again. So, like, I think
unfortunately that happens to everyone in the Big East. Unfortunately.
You are right. I just think that they got to find a way to be close. Whatever happens to them in the conference tournament, they got to be close in these games.
What's wild to me is none of us, we threw out several teams that are on the bubble that we're making a case for, and none of us are making a case for Stanford. I mean, Stanford has been a mainstay in the postseason. Stanford has made the NCAA tournament for the last 36 years. And Ice, correct me if you feel differently, but if Stanford doesn't make a run in the ACC tournament, which is still weird to me that we're talking about Stanford in the ACC tournament.
Okay, I'll never get used to it.
Story for a different day. If they don't make a run in the ACC tournament, I don't think that we see the Cardinal in the postseason.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. To me, they just haven't been consistent enough. Sometimes they're not consistent in how they win, not consistent in how they lose. I also think, maybe my hot take, that them being added to the ACC and then getting games where teams have to play that West Coast swing and they get to play at home, they've been winning a lot of those games because teams have been exhausted traveling across the country and then maybe playing Cal before they play them or vice versa. So just my little hot take there, but I just don't think they've been consistent enough. And, last year, Tara Vanderveer retired, at that time was the all-time winningest coach. And then since then, Gino Auriemma has taken over. But I just think that it's more of a rebuild year for them, where they've just looked around below 500 team to me pretty much all season. I think there's some other teams across the country that could deserve the nod.
Yeah, I think when you're under 500 in your conference, it's always going to be a hard sell. And then the other part of it is, if the committee can't identify really quickly what you do well and what you don't do well consistently, it becomes harder, right? Like, the committee wants to be able to look at it and say, you know what, if this one thing gets worked out, they'll be really competitive in the tournament. I trust that. To Ice's point, I don't think you can do that with Stanford. So unfortunately, but I don't want to, be too philosophical here, but this also becomes a moment where, for Stanford fans, look back at the last 36 years and appreciate it. It shows you how great that run was. It shows you how difficult it is. Like, we take it for granted. Modern women's college basketball, you're not just going to make it in because you're a legacy program. Like, it's just, there's too much competition out there. So I agree with you. It's a rebuild. I think long-term Stanford will be fine, but this year I don't believe they deserve to be in the tournament. Like, if I had to pick between Stanford and any of the teams that we've mentioned, I would pick the teams we've mentioned.
It's so true, though. It proves, well, I think that we just get so spoiled with greatness. And Gino Auriemma is probably the perfect, the face of that. And more recently, Dawn Staley and Kim Mulkey, how she's been able to win championships at two different programs. Like, those have been some of the greatest coaches in college basketball over the last, let's say, decade plus. We take for granted greatness, that the fact that we are seeing Stanford, one of historically the greatest programs in this sport, and we're talking about them as like, they just don't have what it takes to compete in this field. Wild reminder of just how quickly some things can be taken from you. But we'll take a quick break here. Coming up next, Power Hour Power Rankings. And we'll rank chaos that we saw in college basketball this past week. That coming up next. We had some absolute freaking chaos on both sides, both men's and women's. We had buzzer beaters. We had near inexplicable upsets. We had winners of the week and absolute big time losers of the week. So in this week's edition of our Power Hour Power Rankings, we're going to rank the biggest, most impactful wins, losses, and upsets of the week. We saw it on both sides. Ice, I will start with you. We'll kind of list out our nominees of what we thought were some of the more impactful upsets of this past week, and then we will rank them. What are some of your nominees that stick out to you?
Yeah, okay. On the women's basketball side, honestly, there were a ton. It was chaos,
so
like
many.
You mentioned.
Everywhere.
Oh my goodness. I was like, what's everybody doing? At this time of year, we're supposed to know what's happening, but then not, because it's March. And so I guess the madness just started a little early, but
6 top 16 teams lost. almost half of the top 16 lost.
Seriously. Like the number 1 and 2 seeds for the tournament pretty much stayed safe. I think, though, maybe I'll start with the one who may not be safe the rest of this season is LSU. LSU dropped a game to Ole Miss. LSU, a top 10 team in the country. And more importantly, one, I'll say this, credit to Ole Miss, like a very gritty team. I think they're great, have a great coach in Coach Yo. She has a really good style. They've made it to the Sweet 16, so they know how to win this time of year. And I can't overstate how important it is to know how to win this time of year. But for LSU, they are going the rest of the SEC tournament without Flau'jae Johnson. Their leading scorer, their most veteran point guard. I'm not sure how they fare in the SEC tournament without her. So I think that's a loss that it kind of gave a glaring, it put a glaring magnifier on them for the next couple of games. But she's battling an injury. So I think the plan is to have her rest and recover during the SEC tournament, and then they be ready for the NCAA tournament. I will also say Ohio State lost a game to Maryland. Both of those teams were ranked, but man, oh man, was that in a fantastic game. Came down to the wire, almost had like 2 buzzer beaters. First, Ohio State's Madison Green took a layup where she slid like 2 feet, guys, and then got back up and made a reverse layup. Like, it was almost crazy. Everyone was like signaling travel, but it was like too smooth of a slide. So she maintained her dribble. And then right after that, Maryland gets the ball and Sarah Tibiasu just shoots a 1-legged floater from 3 and nails it. And they beat Ohio State. So I think that's a great win for Maryland. They need momentum this time of year. I felt like they had started to get a little bit inconsistent, but an awesome win for the Terps. And then the last game I'll highlight was the game that I was on, where unranked Virginia went into UNC, into Chapel Hill, and gave UNC a loss to finish ACC regular season play. It made sure that they got a 10 seed in the NCAA tournament for Virginia, gave them huge momentum. Mo Johnson, one of my favorite guards to watch this time of year. She's had a huge impactful game. She's had a triple-double this season. But I thought that was huge and hugely deflating for UNC, who is without 2 of their starters right now. And so they're trying to battle multiple storms. They can't win with the players that they do have. And the 2 players that are out are resting and are trying to get back. But they've been out for some games. So I'm not sure what they're going to look like in the ACC tournament.
Yeah, I kept watching that North Carolina loss thinking this is what we've been talking about. Like, this tournament this year is just going to be wild. Like, it didn't make any sense. And by the way, every time I watch that Maryland replay, I was like, the first time I'd watch, I'd be like, oh, that's a travel. And the next time I'm like, no, that's not a travel. I want the refs for once to just come out and be like, hey, guys, we're not really sure. Probably should have been a foul, but the way we look at it, the play was so damn cool. We're just going to let it go because it was so well done.
Right.
I'll add a little bit of men's love to this one. Illinois beating Michigan to me was pretty staggering because Michigan, obviously, we've talked a lot about Michigan and where the Big Ten is right now. And I just felt like not just that Illinois beat them, it's that Illinois beat the pants off of them. Like that was a convincing, hey, Michigan, you don't belong sort of moment. And I kept thinking about, we'll get to later some of the matchups we're waiting for. I kept thinking about, this is not the first time we've seen Michigan get the snot beat out of them by a team in their conference. So these upsets, I think any upset that suddenly makes you say, wait a minute, where are we on that team? Those upsets mean more. So that one definitely hit for me too.
I mean, just talk about something that's kind of inexplicable. And I think it was a reminder, at least to me and maybe to all of us, Illinois is a much better and much more talented team than maybe the record may indicate. And they've just gone through not even the injury bug, but the illness bug that there's been, was it the flu that's been passed around this locker room? So Illinois has just been kind of forced to figure out different starting combinations, been kind of, I don't say this to be, demeaning, but essentially scraping the bottom of the barrel of who they have available on any given night. So I think that game was a reminder, a 20-point win for Illinois that, okay, no, this is a team that can be awfully impressive after getting absolutely trounced by, 50 points against Duke.
Also, though, you mentioned that butt kicking to Duke. Let's give them credit. We mentioned a tough schedule earlier. They played back-to-back-to-back. Michigan State at Wisconsin against Duke, then they had Iowa, then they had Michigan. So 4 of those 5 games that they played are well-respected top 15 programs right now. So they've gone through their own little mini gauntlet. So give the Illini a little bit of credit here.
It also tees up what's going to be a blast of a game to finish out the regular season, Michigan State. We'll get into that. I'll throw in some of my contenders. I live in Nashville, so I'll have a little Tennessee theme going on here. On the women's side, my most impactful upset, I think, was Tennessee losing to Georgia. It was, talking about inexplicable. We're talking about Tennessee, a team that beat UConn earlier in the season, a Tennessee team that was very on track to host a game in the first round of the NCAA tournament, a Tennessee team that's a top 5 seed in the SEC tournament, losing to a Georgia team that's 12-18, and one that odds makers gave Georgia like a 1-point-something% chance of winning that game, and Tennessee loses that game. So that loss drops Tennessee out of the top 16. Obviously, things can change if Tennessee goes on a run in the SEC tournament, even wins the entire thing. Crazier things have happened. Of course, seeding can be shaken up, but right now, Tennessee, after that loss to Georgia, is on the outside looking into the top 16. So that loss was the difference between hosting and not hosting in the first round of the NCAA tournament. And that was also, Tennessee's been on a 53-game home winning streak against unranked teams. 53 games. Snapped that one against Georgia. So just kind of a loss that just kind of goes against what we normally see from Tennessee, which is consistency, at least within the confines of Knoxville, Tennessee. So that's my women's side. And I'll throw an honorable mention out here because we've been talking about, top 10, top 15 teams getting knocked off by unranked teams, like losses that just shouldn't have happened. This game, I don't think can necessarily be considered an upset, but Tennessee beating Alabama. I think Tennessee was probably favored. If they were, it was maybe by a couple of points. If Alabama was, it was maybe by a couple of points. Obviously, a razor's edge and a very thin margin between these two teams. So not necessarily an upset. But when you talk about impact, I mean, Jemai Mashack, final seconds of the game, lobs up a 3. Jemai Mashack, not necessarily Tennessee's best scorer. It's kind of been the biggest topic of conversation throughout this season as far as Tennessee is concerned is, should Jemai Mashack be in the starting 5 when he doesn't offer up the same kind of offensive impact as maybe a Zakai Ziegler or a Chaz Lanier? Jemai Mashack, ball in his hands, last couple of seconds, lobs up a 3 to beat Alabama. So that handed Auburn sole ownership of the regular season championship. And that game could have been the difference between Alabama being a 1 seed versus Tennessee being a 1 seed. And the statistics, at least historically, of men's tournaments and the NCAA tournament and a 1 seed. The 1 seed is won, like 60% of the time, 60+% of the time. There's a very, very small percentage of teams 2 seed and lower that have actually won the NCAA tournament. So getting that 1 seed, it's huge. It's impactful. And obviously, Alabama still has a couple of games left to go. Tennessee has a couple of games left to go. We still have play left in Nashville in the NCAA men's tournament, SEC men's tournament. So a lot of things can change, but at least right now, that game, that single 3 has been the difference between Auburn's lone SEC title and who could potentially be a 1 seed at the end of the season, Fitz.
Let me stack one thing on here. I'm glad we got to this game because I've had this on my chest for a couple of days. I was sitting live on radio as this happened.
Let it out.
My co-host and I may have had a lot to say about this. Here's what I don't understand, Ice. Why is there an epidemic right now in college basketball of teams that can't get the ball inbounded? Because before the 3-point play, Alabama had the ball on their end, easy setup to a play. They got the ball inbounds too late after a 5-second violation. And we've seen this this has become such an epidemic in Connecticut that it's a constant conversation. The guys can't inbound the ball. They can't handle trap defenses, like all of these questions. But we've seen this over and over and over again. Why can teams not inbound the ball?
Okay. My first response from a basketball analyst perspective is literally spacing. Like whether it's the play not being drawn up well or like actual spacing on the floor, but it's just like the spacing is clustered and clobbered. And so you're seeing those traps because they're bringing 2 people to the same spot, telling them both to cut and get open. As a basketball player, though, here's what I will say. Sometimes we as players in the timeout hear maybe the last 20 seconds of the timeout more clearly than the first 10 seconds of the timeout. And so maybe in the first 10 seconds is like, hey, this person take the ball out, you screen, you get open this way, you get open this way, 2 options. And then, guys, the last 20 seconds is, and here's what we're going to run after that. Or here's the action that's going to happen after we get the ball in bounds. Sometimes it's just overlooked and you can't do anything about it. I'll also say, I always taught my players, like, pass fake, bro. If you're taking the ball out of bounds and somebody's guarding you, fake one way, go another. Like, Caroline, this is something we learn when you turn 4 and it's like introduction to basketball. Like, fake one way, go another. And you're like, as a toddler, you think it's like hilarious. Like, oh my God, I'm having so much fun. But literally, like, fake one way, go another, throw the ball in bounds. That's my answer, Fitz.
It drove me crazy. I mean, because we don't even get that 3-point shot if Alabama can get the ball in bounds. And they were in a great position to win the game. Like, I'm watching them with the inbounds. I'm thinking, man, it cleverly, like, at very worst, this is going overtime, but they're probably going to be able to win the game. They'll get a clean look out of it. And then a 5-second violation leads to suddenly charge it down the court. And it's just wild to me. This is going to have to be, because the one thing we know when we get to the NCAA tournament is that coaching matters so much, and you got to be able to process information quickly. I'm watching several teams, not just Alabama, several prominent teams this year have struggled to inbounds the ball. And all I keep thinking is, man, when we get to the back-to-back-to-back moment of the first 3-4 days of the tournament, this is going to rear its ugly head. There will be an upset because somebody can't get the damn ball in bounds, and it drives me crazy.
Well, and there were so many questions I had about Alabama in those last couple of seconds. One, Nate Oates, are you going to take your timeout with you to next week? We're maybe going to plan on calling a timeout anytime soon? You just want to keep that one in your back pocket just for funsies? Not calling timeout there, I think, is one that will keep Nate Oates awake at night. If Alabama is, in fact, on the outside looking in of a 1 seed, which I think that they probably will, with the exception of maybe beating Auburn at the end of the season or whatever it might be. That's going to keep him up at night. And also, we're not going to guard Jemai Mashak. Just wide open. I know he was at quarter court, and I know he's not Tennessee's best shooter. I know that Rick Barnes probably wanted the ball in the hands of Zakai Ziegler, one of his most reliable shooters and, a veteran player. But still, you're not even going to put a guy on him, not even a body on him. So, I mean, I think it's all of these pieces that just came together so perfectly for Tennessee. I know Rick Barnes was talking about after the game, he tried to get a timeout off, that he tried to communicate with Jemai Mashak, hey, get the ball, call timeout, we'll drop a play. We'll drop a more favorable play. One timeout that I'm sure Rick Barnes was probably glad.
Oh, he was livid. He was livid on the sideline. You could see him freaking out that he didn't get his timeout. I'm like, this is great.
So good. So good. So those are all of our nominees. I don't think it's really easy, at least for me, you guys might feel differently, to pick the number one most impactful upset of this past week, because there were so many impactful losses, both in men's and women's, Fitz.
I agree with Ice. That it may not have been the most impactful, but when you talk about upsets this week, that Ohio State-Maryland ending, I think it's one of the best endings we've seen in college basketball, men's or women's, all year. So I want to put that at number one just because that was when you turn on the next day and the number one play on SportsCenter top 10 over and over again is the combination of those two plays. It speaks to something.
And I think to Ice's point as well, LSU losing to Ole Miss, their second straight loss. They went on the road, lost to Alabama. You come back home on senior night and lose to an unranked, albeit very talented and scrappy Ole Miss team. And then you compound that with the loss of Flau'jae Johnson, at least until the end of the SEC tournament. I mean, this is where LSU's depth probably comes into play with Anissa Morrow and Michaela Williams and Samaya Smith. Like, those three are really going to have to step up. But I mean, Flau'jae is the heart and soul of that team. So it's all of those losses, including the loss of Flau'jae Johnson, that has to put LSU, I think, in the top 3 for me.
Yeah. And then I would say Illinois beating Michigan men's basketball. Like we said, they destroyed them. Like, they earned that win. I would also say maybe that slots in as number 3 because that's impressive this time of year.
Yeah.
I love that. I think, yeah. I mean, we've settled on our top 3. There we go. Top 3 feels like that's pretty good.
Yeah. You just throw in the rest of the top 5. DIY rank those. We'll throw in the rest of the top 5, but a crazy last couple of weeks in college basketball. We'll take a quick break here. Coming up next, we'll get into what we are watching this week. All right, we got the women's tournaments going down, women's conference tournaments at least. We have the final week of men's play going down this upcoming week. So, Ice, what are you watching this week?
Yeah, it is a huge week for Michigan men's basketball. I feel like we keep talking about them, but the Wolverines have a tough week. They take on number 13 Maryland during the week, and then the weekend game that Fitz and I both highlighted, they have another rivalry game versus Michigan State. I think this could help truly build their resume if they can pull out being 2-0. I think if they go 1-1, that would be almost nearly fantastic. The danger is going 0-2 against two top 15 teams. It's a tough stretch, but would be awesome if they could at least get one win this week.
Yeah, and I feel like every week I have a new question for Michigan State because, my God, they're certainly playing every week. They've gotten drastically better, and I get that. I've already talked about their shooting issues. Now I'm concerned about their slow start issues. So, like, against Wisconsin, same thing. Like, it feels like their feet are in the mud for the first half, and then all of a sudden, I can't figure out how a team that shoots that poorly from outside manages to separate so much in the second half of games. But that is part of Michigan State's identity right now. Like, it's close at the half, and then in the second half they pull themselves away. Really interested to see what that Michigan State game means because there's so much on the line. I'll add Florida Bama just because that feels like, I mean, let's just go chalk for a second. Florida Bama. How does Bama respond? And you said it earlier, and I think it deserves saying again. Like, Florida at this point has become one of the toughest outs in college basketball. So beating this Florida team is so consequential. This game is just it's rare to get this late in the regular season, know that these teams are all going to be fighting for seeding and still feel like there's that much on the line with this conference game. But my God, like, Florida Bama, it could turn out to be one of the best games of the year.
Yeah, I just have to say, I low-key feel bad for SEC men's basketball. I know in terms of the toughness of the schedule, like it helps with rankings and stuff later and seeding and all that. But literally, guys, like, they've been going through March Madness for the last 12 weeks. Like, for the last 4 weeks, like it has just been ridiculous how many great games there have been. And then it's like, maybe they get to the tournament and play a team that's, 14 seed, and they're like, oh man, thanks. We got a little bit of a break. And then we're right back at it. Like, I almost think some of these teams could say, we're looking forward to the tournament because we might just have a game that we can go out there and dominate and not know that we're playing a top 15 team. I think it's crazy we're seeing this good of a game so late in conference play.
And even a 14, 15, 16 seed in the SEC tournament is a team that could make noise at any given moment.
Seriously.
It's been absurd, Fitz.
I want to live in a world where the teams in the SEC that know they're in rest everybody for the conference tournament. They're like, we don't need this on our legs before we get to March. I know it will never happen. I'm just saying that, the banner for the SEC championship isn't nearly as amazing as the banner for the national championship. So there's going to be a fine line on iron sharpens iron versus, my God, we haven't had a rest in months and we're just fried. We didn't get a night off.
You talked about slow starts. That's immediately what I thought about. Like, teams are starting slow because they're exhausted this time of year and they've got battles day in and day out. And a slow start, just give me time to get into it today.
Right. I mean, like, listen to Bruce Pearl, too, talking about what the regular season SEC means to Auburn. Like, we on the outside might not think it means anything. We on the outside might say, hey, rest is much more valuable than rust when we're going into the NCAA tournament. But I know there have been some fan bases, cough, cough, the big blue, that have been fed up about a former coach not necessarily putting a lot of importance on the SEC tournament. But Fitz, you mentioned Alabama, Florida. That leads perfectly into the game that I'm watching, and it's Alabama-Auburn. I mean, you talk about the SEC schedule as a whole. Look at Alabama's last month and change. Number 1, Auburn. At number 15, Missouri. At home against number 17, Kentucky, again, at the time. And then at home against Mississippi State. On the road at number 5, Tennessee. At home against Florida. And on the road, finishing out maybe one of the most difficult regular seasons in the most difficult place to play in the SEC at Auburn, Alabama, against the number 1 team in the country. That might be one of the most difficult stretches that I have seen in a very long time. But this Auburn-Alabama matchup, I mean, obviously Auburn's already locked up the regular season, but like I mentioned earlier, Alabama still potentially can make a case for a 1 seed if they finish out the regular season with wins over Florida and then at Auburn. So that is going to be a battle between Auburn and Alabama at the end of the season. But got to get past Florida first. And that's no easy out.
That's a tough week. I don't want to be them.
Honestly, guys, like, I don't remember the last time we were seeing this level of basketball in the last week. Like, going into conference tournament play, it feels like it's all gas, no brakes. And I love it for that reason. Like, but when's maybe I'm just being short-sighted. Maybe I'm forgetting last year, the year before in the same way. But man, it just feels like, when was it? Every night you can look at it and be like, no, this matchup is going to be epic. Like, every night leading up to this conference tournament it feels wild to me.
And I know we mentioned a bunch of men's games. We do have the women's conference tournaments coming up this week. And we've got some, maybe not the most exciting matchups in some of these conference tournaments in the first round. I'm just keeping my fingers crossed that we get a Texas-South Carolina rematch and a Notre Dame NC State rematch in the SEC and ACC tournaments, respectively. I think that the bracket makers and whatever powers that be that made these brackets knew exactly what they were doing when they put those two teams in the SEC and those two teams in the ACC on opposite sides of the brackets, because if we can get rematches of those games, ooh, cinema. Pop your popcorn, Fitz. I want them. I need them like I need oxygen.
Yeah, every ounce of this is going to be. By the way, we should give a little on the women's side. We should give Notre Dame some credit. All right, we asked them how they'd respond to being number one. They lost a couple. They won one. All right, so let's get back on the Notre Dame train. Like, Ice was right.
Like, they lost 2 in a row. They hurt my feelings a little bit. I've been raving about them, and then they dropped 2 in a row. Goodness.
But they beat Louisville. So there we go.
They did. Okay.
We're back on track.
They did.
We're back on track.
Half snaps for that. I think what's going to be crazy, Caroline, is if we see USC and UCLA for the 3rd time this season in the Big Ten championship. Like, do we want to watch that again? I kind of do.
It feels so weird.
I kind of do. Yeah, that feels weird. That does feel weird, Fitz. That does feel weird. But I think there are some teams in the Big Ten. If there was a conference tournament that I think you're going to see some upsets, I would keep your eye on Big Ten women's basketball. I think there are a couple of teams that are primed to make an upset where either USC or UCLA does not get to the conference championship.
And we've talked so much about how deep the SEC men's side is, which it is. It is absolutely deserving of all of the hype that we've given it. The Big Ten on the women's side, I'm not going to say is as deep, because I think the SEC has just been unprecedentedly deep and competitive. But the Big Ten women's side is, to your point, Ice, has been so fun to watch. They are projected to get 13 teams into the NCAA tournament. Just absolutely insane. So we've got some awesome action coming up on the hardwood coming up this week, and we will react to all of it coming up on next week's edition of the College Basketball Power Hour. But that is going to do it for us today. He is Jason Fitz. You can find him on Twitter at Jason Fitz. She is at Ice Young 23, and I am at Caroline Fenton 1. Always appreciate y'all for stopping by the pod. So give it a like, give it a subscribe, give it a review, comment, all of those great things. Always appreciate you interacting with us. So tell your friends, tell an enemy, tell an Alabama fan, because they've got a tough couple of weeks coming up for them. But that is going to do it for us today. We will see you next week. We're out.